Good evening. Thank you for joining us for basic Buddhist teaching. How someone can get that out. We're having like a triple happening in Zen. So take two. Thank you for coming this evening. Tonight I am going to be talking about the Buddha's teachings on Samavaka. Probably not pronouncing that right. But the teachings on complete speech, equanimous speech, balanced speech. And I'd like to talk about that in tandem with Sokuzan's emphasis on communication. And I've been looking at a particular text that Senshu Sokuzan lent me recently called The Buddha's Teachings on Social and Communal Harmony. And this draws from the entire collection of Nikayas, the Sutta Nikayas, the original Pali teachings of the Buddha. And Bhikkhu Bodhi, who compiled and translated the majority of this text, did so with the intention of bringing together the Buddha's teachings about Sangha. And one thing that I found very interesting about this is that his emphasis on speech is incredibly pervasive, that there's an entire section Bhikkhu Bodhi devoted just to speech because of how many of the Buddha's teachings address explicitly the way in which practitioners communicate. And this is, I think, really powerful in that this is the same thing we're being talked to about. The three C's Sokuzan has: communication, cooperation, collaboration. But it's that communication that over and over and over again we are reminded of. And so I wanted to read just a little bit in the two sections that I'm going to read out of tonight come from the Anguttara Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya. There's just a few small sections. The first one is the Buddha talking about unwholesome and wholesome actions. And the Buddha actually lists 10 roots of unwholesome action. And of these 10, 4 of them regard speech. So 40% of what the Buddha is saying is the root of unwholesome action is rooted in speech. And he specifically addresses false speech, divisive speech, harsh or abusive speech, and idle or frivolous chatter. And so these are talked about in a lot of ways. And you can talk about them in the negative sense, to not lie, to not cause discord, to not be abusive, to not idly chatter, but they could also be talked about in a positive sense. And so in the suttas, the Buddha talks about just being truthful, as opposed to not lying, being direct. He talks about, instead of not being abusive, speaking kindly, speaking in a way that is supportive. And in regards to not being idle in our speech, discussing the Dharma, he talks about. But the most important thing that I drew out of this is that the Buddha encourages his students never to speak unless it is beneficial to the situation. So it's not just a matter of producing what is kind, producing what is true, producing what is not idle, but having the insight to see, is what I'm going to say, even if it is true, beneficial? Is it fundamentally supportive to the people that I'm endeavoring to communicate with? And then the second part I wanted to read out of is, a lot of times the Buddha's teachings end in verse, like he'll give the sermon and then he wraps it up in verse. And this is the Buddha's teachings on holding discussions. And so I wanted to read these 6 short verses. The Buddha says, "Those who speak with quarrelsome intent settled in their opinions, swollen with pride, ennoble, having assailed virtues, look for openings to attack one another. They mutually delight when their opponent speaks badly and makes a mistake. They rejoice in their bewilderment and defeat, but the noble ones don't engage in such talk. If a wise person wants to talk, having known the time is right, without quarrelsomeness or pride, the sagely person should utter the speech that the noble ones practice, which is connected with the Dhamma and meaning. Not being insolent or aggressive, with a mind not elated, they speak free from envy on the basis of right knowledge. They should approve of what is well expressed, but should not attack what is badly stated. They should not train in fault finding, nor seize on others' mistakes. They should not overwhelm and crush their opponent, nor speak mendacious words. Truly, a discussion among the good is for the sake of knowledge and confidence. Such is the way the noble discuss things. This is the discussion of the noble ones. Having understood this, the wise person should not swell up, but should discuss things. And the way Sokuzan talks about communication or speech is really with the starting point of receiving. That unless we're actually receiving what is in front of us, our communication tends to arise out of, not in a judgmental way, but out of prejudice, out of opinions, out of just ruminations. And it's very dissociated from the situation that's arising in front of us. And so while the Buddha is encouraging to only speak when the situation is appropriate for speech, the other way of talking about that would be to receive, to listen, to consider. And notice how often when we do feel compelled to speech, it is about reifying or contradicting. It's wanting to make sure there's a sense of, oh, we all agree, or letting you know that I disagree. I think that's incorrect. And so I really appreciated Sokuzan's talk just an hour ago for As It Is that most of you were at. And he talked a lot about communication. And I really liked when he talked about being a little bit gullible. And I think for most of us that sounds threatening. We don't want to look foolish, but to have a genuine curiosity of, what are you saying? What is it that you're trying to communicate to me? And that openness to actually consider, no matter how outlandish, at least initially it is, to consider it. And I think Sokuzan even said, be gullible for 30 seconds. He didn't say like go forever. And as some unnamed politician said, drink bleach. But you might listen and say, what is that about? What are you saying? There was a Sufi poet named Hafiz who came after the poet Rumi, and he had a poem that said, listen to everybody as if they were speaking the dying words of your teacher. And I feel that that's what Sokuzan was communicating, that at least initially, whatever you hear, you're so curious as if it were Sokuzan speaking to you, as if it was the last thing Sokuzan would ever say to you, and you want to hear what it is that's being said. And so our communication, our right speech, our complete speech, our samavaka, we have to have some of that vulnerability to actually receive. And in the midst of receiving, to also acknowledge the prejudice that immediately resists or accepts what is being said before we've actually even had a chance to hear it. So if we can, sometimes it may actually even require us to take on a little bit of an attitude of patience, that when we move into a conversation, that the first priority is to receive. The first priority is to consider. And we could go the other way and say you can get bogged down in that as well, where you don't say anything in some form of idealized receiving, idealized communication. And that's why it's not something to be maintained. It's something that we can flash on, we can work on, or coming back to that teaching from Sokuzan, intend. We intend to communicate in a way that is supportive. We intend to communicate in a way that is timely. And we intend to communicate after doing our best to receive what is arising moment by moment. And I can say, having lived in this community for 12 years, and before that, 5 years in dorm rooms in college, and before that, a family of 5, it's very difficult to practice this. It's not something that we simply can just execute or implement. There's so much defensiveness. There's so much fear of being incorrect. And when we buy into that, we find ourselves quarreling. We find ourselves fighting. It's very difficult to see that situationally we may have to just receive the blame, receive the accusation, receive the negativity, and be grateful for it, almost like that, bowing to it. Thank you very much. I have no complaints whatsoever. So I feel that in talking about speech, we can tie it right back in, returning to the intention. Return to the intention. We don't need to idealize it to the point of being perfect communicators, but we can endeavor to receive. We can endeavor to be more direct, more clear in our interactions. Are there any questions so far? You?
Knowing, as you spoke of speaking for the benefit of others, it's as if a gate comes up that says, is this a benefit or is this not a benefit? What do you do? What can you do at that gate?
I think that's where, if we can just flash on that idea of patience, that we don't have to actually know what it means to benefit others, but we can be a little tentative about the impulsive production, the impulsive response. And have you ever had a conversation where you really make it a point to try to wait, and you notice the other person, they might kind of go through the motions of waiting for you to respond, but very quickly they pick right back up. And it's incredible how long you can go without actually saying anything and it not being that out of place. The person just keeps going. So it's that little gap where you think, I need to produce something, I need to respond. And you could actually wait. You could actually stretch that space out a little bit. And even to the point where it starts to be a little uncomfortable. It doesn't need to be very outlandish and performative, but just a little bit of tension before we respond. And we also don't need to over-evaluate it. There are times where it's completely appropriate to just talk, to have a friendly conversation. So sit in White Tara or in the kitchen or in the Sunshine Bardo or wherever you are and just have a conversation. But it's about the awareness or the intention to look more closely at what is it that the Buddha spent so much time talking about, how to communicate. And something Sokodan emphasizes over and over again, how to communicate, how to work with communication. So again, putting a little bit of tension in a process that seems to be or tends to be so automatic.
Shoto bowing. How does looking at this as complete speech help us go into that versus like when it's traditionally called right speech? Bowing.
Do you find that you think one way is correct and one way is incorrect?
Shoto bowing. I think I probably have a preference for the way Sokuzan talks about it.
So notice that preference, and it's not to say that there is a correct or incorrect, but what I'm feeling is what you kind of do is you create right and wrong. That there's the complete way, which is the appropriate, more evolved way of speaking of it, and then there's those people that still talk about right speech. So I agree with you. I think that when we look at that, and I looked up that definition for Sama, and what came up was equanimity, balance beyond extremes. So the right thing is maybe not as traditional. So I would just notice if you're getting bogged down with the idea more than how do I relate to that. And so the idea of complete speech, equanimous speech, balanced speech, speech beyond extremes, whatever you call it, and there may be a way to talk about it that feels more supportive, make sure that we're also looking at it beyond just what we want to elaborate conceptually about it. Further questions? Oh no,
On Divine. What's coming up for me is Sokazan's recent emphasis on enunciation.
yes.
How does that tie into this?
We talked about that maybe a week ago during book study, and just brought up how Sokazan has been more direct about enunciating and being more clear in how I communicate. And the other one he talks about is phrase fillers, those impulsive words, or even that's an impulsive gesture for me. There's kind of a phrase filler through my body. And that the idea is noticing how much of our speech is tied up into that autopilot. We have a particular way of speaking where we don't even consider or investigate it. So it's not about correcting it, but it's looking at how casual we are with speech, how much we take for granted. And I think that when we bring some awareness into the way in which we're communicating, coming back to that word tension, it puts a little bit more intention so that we are, you could say, more intentional of how we communicate. We're more aware of the way in which we actually use our speech to cover up what we would like to say, how we use our body to cover up what we would like to say. You could say it's like a micro outflowing. It's a micro outflow in that there's something arising that is uncomfortable. And so we fill up the space with a familiar gesture or a familiar phrase or a familiar way of speech. And Kayun asked a question that I thought brought a little bit more to that area, in that it's not about being performative. It's not about being pretentious. It's about being very considerate and trying to be everyone here, whether you're here of your own desires or you're here because Sokazan said you had to be here, you're taking time. And in that sense, I can endeavor to be more clear in the way in which I communicate with you. So I think there's a consideration for that relationship, for that exchange. It's very difficult, and I've been really good about adjusting a few of them that Sokazan has pointed out to me, and then the other day a brand new one showed up. I can't remember what it was, but I'm sure he'll point it out again. For a long time it was gonna and talking about that was it. Or probably, or even repetitively saying one particular word. I won't say which word in particular, but there are some words particularly I say a lot. It's kind of fun, except for when it's not. Sometimes it's just like, it's just painful.
Divine, it seems like it's on Divine. It seems like it's slowing down is required for intentionality. Is that true?
I think there's some of that. I think it does disrupt that flow, but we again don't want to take it to an extreme. If it starts to get where it's actually hindering the communication, where you're being so careful about your enunciation that it becomes choppy and you're not actually saying anything, you're just trying to accomplish clear communication. But the little tension of being aware of the small movements I make with my body, or the nodding you do, it's pretty, I mean, that's a little micro outflow, isn't it? And here's mine, I don't know what it is, this right hand flips. Like I think back to like elementary school, someone from Duncan Yo-Yo came into our elementary school and did a yo-yo exhibit. So like flipping the yo-yo. Did anyone else? Yeah, the Duncan Yo-Yo people made their rounds trying to sell yo-yos to elementary kids. Capitalism in America at its finest. So it slows it down just a little bit.
In your mind, it seems in our political arena or world that communication is a mess and can put people on edge at a moment's notice. Is there a way that if we find ourselves in a situation where we're not clear about what's being communicated, is there a way to rectify that situation?
I think that it's important that we can do a few things, and one is ask for clarification. Sometimes we feel like we're unintelligent if we need something explained again. There's a self-conscious, there's a pride in getting it the first time. So to actually be able to say, as we all practice a little bit, could you say that a little differently? Could you say that again? I'm not quite clear on what you're saying. I think that's really important. And I don't know if you do this, but sometimes if I don't actually hear somebody, I just kind of nod. Just go along with it because I don't want to ask. So these little interactions we have on our day-to-day basis, I think are the example we set for the rest of the world. We can't necessarily go in and say, hey, so-and-so, you see the turmoil you're creating for the world, but can we create a small semblance of sanity by giving each other the benefit of the doubt, by trying to understand more clearly what one another's intentions are. And again, coming back to last week, just endeavoring to be kind. I think that was important. The Buddha emphasized that. He said to his students, if you have something to say that's untrue, keep your mouth shut. If you have something to say that is true and is going to cause discord, he changes it. He's like, do your best to keep your mouth shut. He's do your best or endeavor or try not to speak. But if it's true to the situation and if it's beneficial, then speak. We can't always know if it's true and beneficial. So that's where we have to have some flexibility. We know that if our intention is about the benefit of the situation, when we start to get blowback, when we start to get aggression, we don't lean into it and say, well, I'm right, you don't understand, and I'm going to make sure you understand. You might say, maybe I'm not understanding what you're saying. Could you say a little bit more? I'm going to have to think about that. I need to look at that for a little while. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I've done that to a lot of you in this room. And it's not a matter of pacifying. It's because I have to really consider, is what you're saying maybe the case as opposed to what I think to be the case. So that receiving is pretty pivotal in that communication.
And in terms of book study, I think one of the most difficult things for me when we first started that on a regular basis was not getting any feedback from anybody.
Yes.
Whether it's a nod or I'm well aware of my nodding.
Yes.
I also find that I tend not to say something because I already deem it to be not as well phrased maybe as someone else might have. And then I get concerned about what others think about what I may ask or say, like right now. How can we participate perhaps more in book study, especially if we have that kind of fear?
What shows up initially is endeavor not to set up a standard on how to do that. That there are times where you may just find yourself not saying anything and disagreeing. There may be times where you feel like I could ask something about that, but just be careful if we set up a standard of just let it be, don't say anything, keep the peace. That there may be times where you could move into that. And so it takes a little bit more active participation where you have a willingness to experiment, leaning in, leaning out. And I feel that anytime somebody breaks the status quo of communication around the Buddha Dharma is a tremendous opportunity. We sometimes get so isolated in the vocabulary we use around the Buddha's Dharma that we actually begin to think that the way in which it's talked about is the truth. And so when we hear somebody say something contrary to the way Sokuzan might say it, we immediately object. And the way in which we do that is we parrot something Sokuzan has said that would contradict or apparently contradict. So we recently had somebody come and teach here and taught very differently. It was much different than anything we've heard in the Zendo in some time. And it's easy to immediately dismiss it and say, well, that's not understanding, instead of using it to investigate what standpoint, what position am I still grasping onto. It does not mean you need to agree with that person or think it's so valuable or so wonderful, but any resistance we have, whether it's someone participating in book study, giving a Dharma talk, communicating casually, it does provide us an opportunity. Am I opposed to this because of some territory I'm trying to maintain? Or is there actually some insight where I see that that's not particularly helpful? That's not necessarily a good way to go about it. So again, endeavoring to use everything as a teaching, everything as a mirror to point out where we still get tangled up in our passion, aggression, and ignorance. Thank you.
Shoto bowing. I feel like I can be too exacting with like speech sometimes, like where I want so much clarification that the conversation or the communication stops. Is there a way to move forward with some communication when I am just not clear about it?
I appreciate the question. It's incredibly vague. So it would be situational, because there are times where you need to be very exacting. When you built this shrine at Sokuzan's request, you probably were very particular about asking Sokuzan, how would you like this part? How would you like this part? And that was very important. When you're relating to others around their practice, that's where we may need to have more space to relate to the intelligence of the situation. Sometimes it needs to be very sharp and pointed, and sometimes it may need to have some space so that it can breathe a little bit. So there's no way to prescribe that activity, but to, again, come back to looking at how you set up a standard of how to do that, or how you feel that the way you do it is the way that should be replicated by others. Is there further around that? Yes.
Shoto bowing. Can we investigate that position when it's not being triggered?
Maybe a little bit, but if you get too drawn into that, it's just another labyrinth of, you're doing the very thing you're trying to look at. It just feels more objective. You're going in there with some hemostats and some tweezers and magnifying glass, and you're trying to see if there's some substance there that you can figure out. As I've said before, the way it's shown up for me over my time here is that as much time as I can practicing, and the way in which it needs to arise, manifest outside of meditation, takes care of itself. Utilize the forms, utilize the teacher, and continue to get that clarification, even if it feels a little embarrassing, the responses you get, because you think you're asking something sincere and you just get, wow, just take care of it. Jesus Christ, Shoto. Thank you. Michelle.
Michelle Valian. I often have a hard time putting something into a question. Like, I'm listening to you now and I'm relating it to a situation that I just had maybe a few hours ago, where I was waiting at Little Caesars for pizza and I was timing to see how long it actually took.
Okay, red flag one.
As they said, it would be 7 to 10 minutes, and I was like, I don't really think that's gonna happen.
How long was it?
About 21 minutes.
Oh.
And I was getting really irritated. And that irritating started to brew. And oh my gosh, I really wanted to complain to this family next to me, just because I felt for some reason that I needed to just be like, man, remember to just order your pizza online and not just go in there, because it's not like a hot and ready anymore.
Okay.
It's like, anyways. but I did. I just kind of just was like, they're dealing with their own stuff. But when I'm hearing something, oftentimes I feel like I can relate it to something, but I might not always have a question around it. Is there a way for me to form a question around a situation like that when I'm like, okay, I'm relating, but I don't really have a question, but I feel like I want to participate?
Do you ask a question once a week,
Nope,
once a month?
I haven't in a long time.
Yeah, maybe you should have some fun with it and like write something down, and even if it's just like very sterile, just kind of like, so Chiezan, I have a question for you. I think it's important. I think it's just put a little energy into it. Once a week, say, I'm gonna ask a question. It might be simple. It might be something I already know. Like, so Chiezan, what do you mean by communication? So Chiezan, I don't entirely understand the first noble truth. How does that show up in practice? So it doesn't have to be some elaborate special question. It's the interaction that's important. That being said, I'm not saying that you need to prescribe a question a week, but again, if you're finding yourself less and less and backing away, you might just put something out there. There's a lot of opportunities to ask questions, and so to do that a little bit seems good. Further questions? I could just make something up too. You could do in that situation with the family is completely throw yourself for a loop and ask them about something completely unrelated. You become so consumed with this pizza thing. Hey, I really like your shirt. Where'd you get that? And just notice what it does, because you have a feeling, it feels real, it is intense, you want to outflow, you want some sort of relief from that through acknowledging it to somebody, complaining to somebody, and see what it's like to acknowledge something else that's happening very much in the present moment. I come back to Sokazan's ASAP, flashing on a sense. And I remember vividly, I asked him, well, isn't that ignoring the thought? And he said, no, it's acknowledging something that is completely the case and you're already ignoring. You think your thought is so important that your breath, your smell, your taste is not valid at that moment. So similarly, you could just see what it's like to bring your attention to something else in the space that has nothing to do with what you want or the timer on your phone. I like Mioka. I don't know if you heard him. He said 21 seconds or 21 minutes and 34 seconds. Very clear. Thank you for asking a question.
Zuku bowing, you brought up earlier that we may not always know what's true or beneficial.
Yes.
How do we work with if somebody's asking us for information and we have no idea if it's beneficial or not? Should we hold back in that instance?
Situationally, but don't overthink it. Like, do not create a huge structure. Just like around kindness, we don't need to have an elaborate philosophy around kindness, but we talk about it in different ways. We don't need to have an elaborate structure around communication. All my intention was with this talk is to acknowledge something that Sokazan talks about that's been very helpful to me, and reading it and listening to how Bhikkhu Bodhi says it's almost a disproportionate amount of time that the Buddha is talking about speech. I was like, that's probably a good thing to look at, but I wouldn't overanalyze it. If someone asks you for information, that's the word you used, information, and you have it, you could just give it to them. It can be very practical. I think when we begin to see our reference points, when we begin to see the standards we set up and they're not as substantial as we thought, the communication can have more flexibility so that when the person responds differently, you can adjust. You can relate to them as they start to soften or as they start to harden. You don't have to stick to your guns on the content. Thank you. Any questions on Zoom, Jishin?
Jishin Bang, you said our intention is the benefit of the situation. What is the benefit of the situation, Bowing?
Man, I have no idea what I meant by that if I said that. The intention is the benefit of the situation. I have no idea, and I apologize if I did say that. I don't know what I meant. Thank you. Thank you for your patience with me. Any other questions this evening? Any questions from anyone that never asks a question? Any questions from anyone who's here only because Sokuzan makes them be here? He doesn't make anyone be here, just encourages us to be here.
When you're bowing.
Ray Bao.
Ray, go ahead, please.
Okay. I'm curious about speech that is wrong speech, but harmful speech, like the intention is to harm. A story comes to mind about when the Buddha was in the forest and he ended up eating, and his friends came along and said, "Oh, there's a guy who breaks his vows," or something like that. That kind of cutting remark. This I found I was curious about. I've experienced it as a phenomenon, and I wonder what your thoughts are on it.
Don't do that if you can help it. I don't think it's much more complicated than that, but at the same time, we have those impulsive outflows where we say something cutting or something biting. And what we need to look at, not need to, but you might look at that point, is how that aggression wants to flip into passion, as Sokuzan talks about. How we notice, or there's that feeling, I shouldn't have said that. And so we immediately go into trying to recover that or pacify it. And it's not necessarily out of anything other than we don't want to have the feeling of remorse. So trying to see if we can be aware when we want to outflow in such a way that's the only intention is to say something spiteful. I tend to be very sarcastic. I was sarcastic once with Sokuzan in the Hojo, and I'm, as far as I know, the only person who's ever been kicked out of the Hojo. It's very hard. I mean, this is my teacher. I've devoted my life to this community and his teachings, and here I am still being sarcastic. So if it's outflowing in that situation, it's probably going to show up in every situation. And so noticing after that production to try to receive the avalanche of negativity, of shame, of remorse, of regret, and don't cover that up with trying to remediate. That is not to say you don't say, "I am sorry I said that. That was not appropriate. I didn't mean to cause harm." But as Sokuzan says, apologize once. And when he says that, it's not even a standard. You may situationally see that this person may need to hear this a few times, but you're not continuing to belabor the point because you want to feel better about it. So I don't know if that's in the area that you are asking about, but that's what shows up for me when you ask the question.
Curiously, it related to something I experienced. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to have you, and thank you for your question. Unyo.
And you're bowing. Just the whole idea of right speech or complete speech. Speech is so important to us in this country. And like Mozuku's question is, how do we know when what we're listening to, reading is the truth or not? And then, because then we act on certain things. I find myself terrified at what I hear by former leaders of this country or current leaders. So as a bodhisattva on this path, what responsibility do we have to the wider community in terms of complete or right speech?
Thank you. So it felt like there was a few parts. So when you're taking on this information, how do you not believe or disbelieve? How do you know what to believe? I would say don't take any position on it because it's such an incredible abstraction. It's so far removed from our experience that all we do is elaborate in such an abstract way where we we actually reify one another by saying, I can't believe that happened, or can you believe that? This place is coming to pieces. And so where do we start? We start with the intimacy of our environment, of our situation. The bodhisattva doesn't have to go somewhere to be a bodhisattva. The bodhisattva works with the raw material of the situation. So it is not an apathy or an indifference from the tremendous suffering of the world, but what is the suffering of the person in the room with you? What is the suffering that's still going on within oneself that causes so much struggle? So we start out in that simple way of training the mind, looking at the mind, endeavoring to relate to the people that come into our world, come into our life. See if we can't create some sense of well-being within the very context we work in on a daily basis, while not ignoring what's happening globally, nationally, internationally. And as somebody with a small child, I can resonate. It's like, I don't know what kind of world will be there in 14 years when he graduates from high school, if there'll be a world. It probably will be unrecognizable. And it's not to say I can get rid of those fears, but what can I do right now? Can I provide a safe environment for him? Can I help foster this vision that Sokuzan has that seems to create a space where people can practice that kindness? And on another simple level, just interacting with our neighbors, interacting with the shopkeepers around here. It's wonderful when you can be somewhere and you recognize people and you can be just friendly to one another. So I would start here and notice when we become so consumed in the abstraction of the world that we lose sight of the very war that's raging within this room, within ourselves, within the community, within the city, the neighborhood. There's plenty of suffering. There's plenty of work to do as bodhisattvas. Meaningful work right here. Mozuku?
Ozuku bowing, the example of getting kicked out of the Hojo.
Yes.
You did apologize, or was that hypothetical?
Oh, no, that I was humiliated. It was one of the most painful experiences in my time with Sokuzan. And he didn't really have to do anything. I was just very flippant and sarcastic. He said, get out, get out. He didn't even yell, which made it worse maybe. It was just like, we're not doing this, get out. And so I protested and I fought, and then he said, go sit in the Zendo for 10 minutes and you can come back in. But that was pretty powerful teaching, because like I said, if you can become so dissociated from the situation you're in that you can outflow in that way, how much easier to do so in a casual setting. I was an actual Dokusan, and that's a mirror, a pretty bright one.
Ozuku bowing, my question's around apologizing in a situation like that. You said you might apologize once. Is the intention of that apology to pacify the situation?
In that situation with Sokuzan, it was probably more about just the humiliation, the embarrassment of I can't believe I just said that. In other situations, it's just that basic acknowledging you, like, I see that caused you pain, and that does not feel good. I'm sorry that happened. So it can be just a simple acknowledgement. It's not necessarily pacifying. It's not apologizing, looking for a result.
Ozuku bowing, I'm still thinking about the encouragement to speak when it's beneficial, and I guess I'm not clear on what is the benefit of an apology, ideally.
You don't know either. That doesn't make sense.
Ozuku bowing, I'm not saying it doesn't. I think I apologize out of, I don't want somebody to be mad at me. I want to pacify the situation. I'm just
Okay.
looking at my own intention around
So
it.
that's all rich. That's all incredibly rich territory. That's enough. Just look at that area. It's not complicated. If you actually see the way in which you've caused harm or pain for somebody else, It doesn't feel good. I don't think any of us feel really good about causing discomfort and pain for others. So I think to just acknowledge that, just that connection, just caring about somebody for the very sake that they're there in front of you. They don't need to deserve that care. It's just, I don't want you to be in pain. And I know that my neurotic mind can slap out sometimes, so I apologize for that.
Ulrika Bowing, if we see that our intention is more self-centered, or should we still, is it still beneficial to apologize for the other person's sake?
Probably. Thank you. I'd like to invite you all tomorrow to a number of forums we're having. It's a pretty big day at Sokokoji. 11 a.m. Eric Wilson, I said this afternoon, he's been practicing Sokokoji, he's been living here for a while, for a long time, practicing with us. So he's going to be receiving the 16 Bodhisattva precepts from Sokuzan at 11 a.m. Please join us if you're able to. It would mean a lot to all of us. And at 2:30 p.m., Sokuzan will reaffirm and establish Sokokoji as the Order of Immediate Light, a separate order within the Soto Zen lineage that acknowledges his training with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in the Karma Kagyu lineage, and his training with Kobenchino Roshi in the Soto Zen lineage, and how those have come together to form and express itself as Sokokoji. So that's the 3rd year since since Sokuzan established us as that order. So that forum will take place from 2:30 to 3:30 about, and if you're able to, please join us. With that, we can close. Thank you all for the questions and joining tonight.
May the benefits enter into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. The 10 directions, so 3 times, all Buddhas, it's all venerable ones. Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita.
O Buddhism, Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokokoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, its buildings, gardens, and all adjoining areas from any and all dark or negative energy. Remove and dissolve any negative energy or devices. Fill everything and everyone with light. Please shield and protect with light our teachers, monks, students, and all practitioners of the Dharma, our families and friends from negative forces and energy from now on. Help us to realize the truth of the Buddha's teachings.
That concludes our forums for this evening. If we could please reset the Zendo, that would be helpful.